There are moments in history when entire nations tremble, when kings rise in power and believe themselves unstoppable, when fear spreads like fire and hope seems to vanish. But sometimes God chooses the most unexpected person to change everything. In the days of King Nebuchadnezzar, ruler of a vast and fearsome empire, a command went forth, one that would shake nations to their core. His general Holofernes, a man of ruthless precision and unquestioned loyalty, was set to conquer the lands that had refused to submit. City after city fell, nations were crushed, temples were destroyed, and fear spread like a shadow across the earth. Holofernes did not just seek victory, he demanded submission, not only to the king, but to his power, his authority, his will, and any who resisted were erased. Soon word of his approach reached the land of Israel. Panic took hold. The people knew what this meant. They had seen what happened to others. Cities burned, lives destroyed, faith trampled under the weight of conquest. The elders gathered, the people cried out, and in their fear they turned not to weapons first, but to God. They fasted, they prayed, they put on sackcloth. Even the priests fell on their faces before the altar, pleading for mercy, for protection, for deliverance, because they knew something deeper than fear. They knew that victory did not come from strength alone. In the hill country stood a town called Bethulia, a gatekeeper to the land. If Bethulia fell, the path to Jerusalem would be open. And so Holofernes set his sights on it. He surrounded the city, cut off its water, and waited. Days passed, then weeks. The sun burned hotter, the wells ran dry, and inside the walls, desperation grew. Children cried for water. Mothers weakened. Hope began to fade. The leaders of the city, overwhelmed by suffering, began to waver. How long can we endure this? They asked. Let us surrender before we all perish. But not everyone agreed. There were still voices clinging to faith. Yet even they were tested. Finally, a decision was made. If God does not deliver us within 5 days, we will surrender. 5 days. They gave God a deadline, but in that same city, there was a woman, quiet, observant, unknown to many, but known to God. Her name was Judith. Judith was a widow, beautiful in appearance, but even more striking in spirit. She lived a life of discipline, prayer, and devotion. While others were consumed by fear, she remained anchored in faith. When she heard the decision of the elders, something stirred within her, not fear, not doubt, but conviction. She called for the leaders, and when they came, she spoke with authority that silenced the room. Who are you, she said, to put God to the test, to set a time limit for the Almighty? You speak as if you understand His ways, as if His power is bound by your expectations. If He chooses to save us within 5 days, He will. But if He does not, He is still God. Judith reminded them of something they had forgotten in their fear. God is not controlled by man. God is not rushed by desperation, and God is never late. Then she said something unexpected. I will do something that will go down through generations. You will hear of it. Long after this day, but she did not reveal her plan, not yet. While an army surrounded the city, and fear gripped the hearts of many, God had already chosen the instrument of deliverance, not a warrior, not a king, but a woman who was not afraid to trust him. As the weight of fear pressed heavily upon Bethulia, Judith withdrew, not in hesitation, but in preparation. She entered her chamber and fell before God, pouring out a prayer not of desperation, but of bold faith. She called upon the same God who had delivered Israel in generations past, the God who brings down the proud and lifts the humble. She did not ask for safety, she asked for strength. Strength to carry out what she believed had already been set in motion by divine will. Then something changed. The woman once clothed in mourning arose with purpose. Judith set aside her garments of sorrow and clothed herself in beauty, not out of vanity, but strategy. She adorned herself with elegance, preparing not for celebration, but for confrontation. Taking only her maid with her and carrying provisions, she made her way to the city gates. When the guards saw her, they were stunned, but she spoke calmly, confidently. She told them she was going to the enemy camp, claiming she had a plan that would lead to Israel's deliverance. Though they did not fully understand, they allowed her to pass, watching as she walked into the unknown, alone. Outside the safety of the city, the atmosphere shifted. The sounds of soldiers, the presence of an overwhelming army, the reality of danger, it all surrounded her. And yet Judith did not falter. When the Assyrian patrol found her, they were captivated by her presence. Her beauty disarmed them. Her composure intrigued them. She was brought before Holofernes. The general sat surrounded by power, accustomed to fear, used to obedience. Yet when Judith entered, something was different. She did not come trembling, she came composed. Her words were careful, her tone respectful, yet beneath it all was a quiet confidence. She spoke as though she had insight others did not. She told Holofernes that the people of Israel would soon fall, not because of his strength, but because of their own actions. She claimed she knew when they would sin against their God, and when that moment came, their protection would be lifted. All he had to do was wait. Holofernes listened, not because he trusted her completely, but because he was intrigued. Pride often blinds more effectively than darkness. Judith was given a place among them, freedom to move, access, opportunity. Each night she would leave the camp under the pretense of prayer, maintaining her devotion, keeping her focus aligned with purpose. Days passed, and trust began to form. The guards lowered their suspicion. The general grew comfortable. Everything was aligning. Then came the night. A banquet was prepared, lavish, excessive, filled with indulgence. Holofernes, desiring to impress Judith, drank more than he ever had before. Wine flowed freely. His judgment faded. His strength weakened. And as the night deepened, so did his vulnerability. One by one the servants left. The tent grew quiet. And there, in the dim light, Judith stood alone, with the man who had brought terror to nations. For a moment, time seemed to pause. This was the turning point, the moment where fear could rise, or faith could act. Judith stepped forward, not as a victim, but as the instrument of something far greater. She prayed silently, asking for strength one final time. Then, taking Holofernes' own sword into her hands, she struck with decisive force, once and again, until it was finished. The enemy who had seemed unstoppable was no more. With steady hands, she placed his head into a bag carried by her maid. There was no panic, no chaos, only urgency guided by purpose. And as quietly as she had entered, she left, through the same paths, past the same guards, under the same night sky. But everything had changed. Under the cover of night, Judith and her maid moved swiftly away from the enemy camp, carrying with them the evidence of a victory no one would yet believe. The same path that had led her into danger now led her back toward hope. As they approached the gates of Bethulia, the watchman, stunned to see her return alive, quickly raised the alarm. The city awakened, and word spread rapidly. Judith had come back. The elders and people gathered, their faces filled with anticipation and disbelief. Standing before them, no longer just a widow marked by quiet devotion, but a vessel of bold deliverance, Judith called them to give praise to God, declaring that he had not abandoned his people. Then, without hesitation, she revealed what she carried the head of Holofernes. Shock rippled through the crowd as fear turned instantly into awe, and despair gave way to renewed hope. The enemy they had dreaded, the man whose presence had brought terror to nations, was no more. Judith refused to take credit for herself, directing all glory to God. She urged the people to act quickly, instructing them to display the head upon the city walls at dawn, so that the enemy would see and be thrown into confusion. As morning came and the head was raised high, the Assyrian camp was plunged into chaos. Soldiers rushed to their leader's tent, only to discover the unthinkable: their commander was dead. Panic spread, discipline collapsed, and the once feared army was overtaken by fear. Seizing the moment, the men of Israel surged forward, not in desperation as before, but with renewed courage. They pursued the fleeing enemy, striking them down and reclaiming their land. What had once seemed like certain defeat turned into overwhelming victory, not by strength alone, but by faith that had been restored at the brink of surrender. When the battle ended, the people returned with more than victory. They carried a renewed belief in God's power. Songs of praise replaced cries of fear, and worship filled the city. At the center of it all stood Judith, not seeking power or recognition, but honored as one who had trusted God completely. She lifted her voice in a song of triumph, proclaiming that God brings down the proud and lifts up the humble, that true strength is found not in force, but in faith. Though she could have claimed influence or authority, Judith chose a life of humility. She returned to her home and lived in peace, her purpose fulfilled. Her story spread far beyond her lifetime, becoming a lasting testimony that God often works through the unexpected, that courage rooted in faith can overcome even the greatest threat. Long after the battle had faded from memory, the impact of her obedience remained. Her life stood as a reminder that when fear rises and hope begins to fail, it only takes one person willing to trust completely to change the course of everything.